But once Suits gave her a bigger platform and introduced her to a more influential social world in Toronto, her previous life quickly became something she viewed as excess baggage. People connected to that social circle during the transition described someone methodically reshaping her entire life. Friends who no longer served a purpose slowly disappeared from her orbit. Contacts who couldn't elevate her status were filtered out one by one. Then came the now infamous FedEx package. No emotional conversation, no heartfelt explanation. No heartfelt explanation? Just a delivery containing her wedding and engagement rings, returned as casually as defective merchandise. The message required no interpretation. The Trevor chapter was over. The future global icon chapter had officially begun. But Trevor wasn't only left with heartbreak. He was left carrying knowledge about events that existed long before he entered her life. During their years together, Trevor became aware of an earlier chapter Meghan had carefully kept out of public view. Before the auditions, before the red carpets, there had reportedly been a first marriage. Quiet, impulsive, and far away from media attention. And according to individuals deeply familiar with Los Angeles and Chicago social circles at the time, that relationship allegedly resulted in a child. A daughter named Nall. Reports claim the child was eventually taken in by the Giuliano family in Chicago, raised far away from the carefully manufactured Meghan Markle image. And if those allegations hold any truth, it would explain the desperate push for a completely clean narrative during the royal engagement years. Because you cannot present yourself as the authentic Duchess, the symbol of modern motherhood and generational healing. If somewhere in the Midwest there's a daughter who spent her entire life watching her biological mother perform compassion for a global audience, fame alone was never the goal. She wanted something much larger than celebrity status. She wanted to become an archetype, and archetypes cannot carry visible contradictions from the past. So according to these claims, the daughter was quietly erased from the narrative, discarded with the same cold efficiency as the rings sent back through that FedEx package. But the most unsettling part of this story isn't simply that a child may exist. It's what that child represents now, in 2026, because Noelle is no longer a child. She became an adult. She built her own life. She started a family of her own. And that realization is reportedly creating panic behind the scenes in Montecito. The woman currently producing content centered around feminine empowerment and authentic motherhood is biologically already a grandmother. Think about the emotional contradiction. While magazine spreads photograph her dressed as a young mother discussing the challenges of raising toddlers in a California mansion, there is allegedly a grandchild she has never met, connected to a daughter she has never publicly acknowledged. This is where the polished image collides headfirst with reality, and according to reports, this is the exact information that eventually reached Harry during a period where his personal and professional life had already begun unraveling. When details connected to Trevor's knowledge reportedly started circulating inside Harry's inner circle, the emotional fallout was severe. For years, Harry genuinely believed he was protecting someone. Ever since losing Diana, he carried the trauma of not being able to save his mother from the forces surrounding her. He swore he would never again stand by while a woman he loved was hunted, cornered, or silenced by an institution. So, he viewed Meghan through the lens of unresolved grief. In his mind, she was another Diana, another woman being persecuted by the system, and he responded not as a prince, but as a wounded son, desperate to rewrite history. But by 2026, that illusion reportedly became impossible for him to maintain. Harry slowly began realizing he hadn't necessarily rescued someone in danger. He had stepped into a role that had already been written for him. One of the most disturbing details tied to this realization is the story surrounding the so-called vision board. Individuals connected to Meghan's earlier years in Los Angeles allegedly described a board filled with carefully selected goals and imagery long before she ever crossed paths with the royal family. And it reportedly wasn't just focused on generic fame or Hollywood success. The board allegedly included references to the British monarchy itself. There were reportedly notes and images tied specifically to Prince Harry, his interviews about wanting stability and family, his grief surrounding Diana, and his visible longing to belong somewhere emotionally secure. According to these accounts, meeting Harry was never random. She didn't stumble into him accidentally at Soho House. She had studied him beforehand. She recognized a man carrying deep emotional wounds that could potentially be leveraged into access to a platform no Hollywood career alone could ever guarantee. She understood that if Harry believed he was saving her from becoming another Diana, he would sacrifice absolutely everything to protect her. And that is exactly what happened. He walked away from his family. He surrendered military honors, royal responsibilities, his country, and even the life he was born into. He followed the script perfectly. But what the script failed to anticipate was one unavoidable reality. Eventually, the truth moves faster than public relations. The dark irony of 2026 is that Diana's own tragedy appears to have been turned into emotional leverage against her son. Diana spent years struggling to tell her truth inside a system designed to suppress. She fought constantly to reclaim her own voice, culminating in the Panorama interview where she desperately tried to show the world the human being behind the royal title. Harry witnessed every painful moment of that battle. He saw what silence did to her. And according to what sources claim Trevor later shared, Meghan didn't run from that narrative. She studied it. She recreated the emotional conditions around it. She offered Harry the opportunity to become the hero he failed to be at 15 years old. In many ways, she presented herself as his second chance to save Diana. But now, sitting in California in 2026, surrounded by reports of separate business paths and increasingly independent public brands, Harry is reportedly beginning to understand something devastating. The crisis may have been built into the story from the very beginning. While he believed he was battling the British media, the far more explosive narrative may have been hidden elsewhere the entire time, inside a FedEx package and somewhere in suburban Chicago. He is now confronting the possibility that a daughter was systematically erased from the public narrative all along. A daughter who allegedly spent years hearing speeches about empathy and compassion, while never receiving even the most basic acknowledgement from her biological mother. And for Harry, a man deeply obsessed with legacy, bloodlines, and family history, the existence of that daughter and the grandchild connected to her may be impossible to reconcile with the image he was sold. So where does the story go from here? Legally, the situation remains explosive because Trevor Engelson never signed an NDA. He remains the unpredictable variable no one in Montecito can fully control. He can speak, he can write, he can produce. Reports coming from people connected to the Sussex management circle suggest that simply hearing Trevor Engelson's name now triggers absolute panic behind closed doors. For years, an enormous protective wall has been built around the Montecito narrative, but Trevor remains the one person capable of walking straight through it without resistance. The rushed legal outreach, the back-channel conversations through intermediaries, and the full activation of crisis management teams all point toward one uncomfortable reality. People only panic when someone is about to tell a story they know is true. At the same time, those close to Harry in 2026 describe someone emotionally drained from carrying the burden of the performance. For years, he defended a narrative he is now slowly beginning to understand may have been carefully engineered from the beginning. He looks at the daughter Meghan allegedly never acknowledged and sees a warning sign he once promised himself he would never overlook again. He's beginning to realize that the protection he offered, the royal titles he sacrificed, and the family he walked away from may have all been pieces of a larger vision first imagined years earlier on a vision board in Los Angeles. And now, the silence is beginning to crack, not because the media is chasing them, but because reality has finally started catching up. Trevor Engelson stayed quiet for more than a decade. He watched the world embrace the fairy tale. He sat back while the interviews aired and the documentary shaped public opinion. But by 2026, that silence has reportedly reached its breaking point. The daughter still exists. The grandchild still exists. And the man once replaced by a prince may finally be ready to reveal what happens when the carefully crafted icon loses control of the script. If this story resonates with you, if you believe buried truths eventually belong to the public, then you'll want to stay for what comes next. Subscribe to this channel because the next chapter is already unfolding, not only in quiet Hollywood circles, but inside courtrooms as well. We are moving into the era where masks begin to fall away, and you won't want to miss the moment the silence finally shatters. We'll be here documenting every development. Make sure you are too. A truth about 2026 is that audiences are no longer satisfied with carefully managed narratives. We live in a time where receipts matter more than reputation. And while the Montecito brand attempts to reinvent itself through lifestyle projects, cooking content, and image rehabilitation, the unresolved past continues haunting every polished rebrand. You can swap PR teams. You can redesign a public image. You can rewrite headlines and reshape narratives. But some facts remain impossible to erase. You cannot erase the wedding rings returned inside a FedEx envelope. You cannot erase the reality of a daughter growing up without her mother. And you certainly cannot erase the fact that Trevor Engelson reportedly knows every hidden chapter of the story, without any NDA preventing him from speaking openly. As 2026 moves forward, the real question is no longer whether the truth eventually surfaces. The question is how much of the royal fantasy remains standing once it does. Harry now appears trapped between two realities: the royal world he abandoned and the new life he believed he was building. But the problem with foundations built on unstable ground is that eventually the tide reaches them. The daughter in Chicago, a Hollywood producer in Los Angeles, the prince caught in the middle. All three now seem tied together in a story approaching its inevitable climax. The burden of an unacknowledged life is not something that disappears quietly. And as the public continues watching, the fractures are becoming harder and harder to ignore. This has evolved beyond a simple royal controversy. At its core, it's a story about the cost of unchecked ambition and the painful clarity that arrives when someone realizes the person they thought they were saving may have been guiding them toward destruction from the very beginning. The silence is ending. The truth is beginning to surface. And for the woman who built an empire around controlling her voice, 2026 may become the first year she realizes the loudest voice in the room belongs to the one she spent years trying to suppress. Stay tuned, because the next chapter could completely reshape everything people believe they know about the woman once viewed as a future queen. The evidence continues building. More voices are beginning to emerge, and the Montecito machine appears to be running dangerously low on momentum. The truth is approaching, and this time it's arriving with receipts. Be here when it does. Is it worth the cold dismantling of a decade-long marriage? The public is finally beginning to see the bill for that ambition, and the total may be larger than anyone, even a duchess, can afford to pay. The story of the daughter who was never acknowledged may ultimately be the piece that unlocks the entire puzzle. And once that door opens, it can never fully be shut again. Diana's legacy was built on painful honesty. She was willing to risk everything in order to live authentically. The tragedy of Harry's journey may be that he searched for that same honesty in a world where so much had already been carefully manufactured. And by 2026, he is finally confronting that reality. He looks at his children now and reportedly understands that the greatest inheritance he can offer them is not titles, prestige, or Netflix contracts. It's the truth. And that truth begins with the name that was never spoken. It begins with the name that has never been spoken aloud. It begins with a face that has never been publicly recognized. And it begins with a daughter who has spent her life waiting for the silence to finally carry meaning. By 2026, this story has crossed the point where there's no turning. The world is now watching what appears to be the quiet separation of two brands that once depended entirely on each other, while cameras searched endlessly for joint appearances that never materialized. Harry was reportedly retracing his own path in silence. People close to him in London describe someone no longer interested in conflict, but searching for something far more personal. Sense of home. He's beginning to understand that the freedom promised in California came with a cost he can no longer emotionally afford. Not financially, but psychologically, in the currency of identity itself. The realization that he may have unknowingly become a piece in someone else's long-term vision isn't merely humiliating. It shatters the entire framework through which he viewed his life. He walked away from one of the world's oldest and most stable institutions, believing he was choosing authenticity, only to allegedly discover that the woman beside him had concealed an entire reality, including a grandmotherhood she never publicly acknowledged. The emotional contradiction is enormous. While she continues presenting herself to the world as a modern young mother raising 2 children, the existence of another generation, a granddaughter she has reportedly never met, stands as a silent contradiction to the image being sold publicly. And that is why this story extends far beyond the allegation of a hidden daughter. It points towards something larger, a repeated pattern of emotional detachment and strategic removal. Because if someone can allegedly erase a child in order to preserve a carefully crafted image, then what happens to a prince once his role as protector is no longer necessary? Harry is reportedly beginning to see the growing professional distance between them for what it may truly represent. Preparation for a future where his royal identity is no longer required to create opportunities. The titles already exist. The children already exist. Fame is already secured, and the subscription to the prince may be approaching its expiration date. Meanwhile, the voices surrounding Trevor Engelson continue getting louder. The conversation is no longer centered only on FedEx envelope. Attention is now shifting toward the Toronto years, toward the private discussions that allegedly took place before the blind date that altered the course of royal history forever. Those accounts describe a woman deeply fascinated by the monarchy, long before she officially entered it. Not an outsider stumbling accidentally into royalty, but someone who had studied the institution carefully from a distance. And perhaps the most painful realization Harry now faces in 2026 is this: the institution he once believed trapped him may actually have recognized the warning signs long before he did. In other words, he may not have escaped the villains. He may have walked away from the very people attempting to protect him. The daughter, who was never acknowledged, remains the final missing piece that ties the entire narrative together. She represents undeniable proof that the past never stays buried forever. And as the Montecito operation reportedly struggles to contain the growing attention surrounding Trevor's freedom to speak without an NDA, the public waits for the moment when the silence surrounding the alleged grandmother in the mansion can no longer be maintained. This is the final stage of the 26 story. The scripts were written long ago. The roles have already been performed. But now the curtain is beginning to fall on a narrative built on unstable ground. From the very beginning. Now, because when the final chapter unfolds, you won't simply hear about it afterward. You'll watch the entire narrative unravel in real time. We're staying until the very end. Make sure you're here when it happens.